They said the wind did the talking in that valley, and the town learned to listen. The sun baked the dirt into a hard skin, and the wooden sign over the general store swung with a dry creak that sounded like a warning. People moved carefully, not so much out of courtesy as out of habit, so they would not overcrowd whatever need had carved itself behind the shop's locked back door. For 3 years, the story ran in small, dependable whispers. A debt that never quite closed. A ledger that always found another page. A woman who grew thinner in the shape of a willingness to survive. Mateo Salgado arrived on a noonday wind, with a horse that knew the sound of long roads and a face the sun had mapped into thin lines. He rode like a man who carried silence as much as baggage, and in a place where language served as cover, silence read like confession. He tethered his mare at the edge of town, fingers finding the knot without hurry, and let the town fold around him like something that had been waiting. He saw Alma first as everyone else did. A shadow at the threshold of Don Eusebio Carranza's shop, her shoulders turned so often they might have been carved that way. She moved with the discipline of someone who measures each breath against the danger of standing out. Her hands were steady, she balanced jars and bundles with the same economy she used to hide the tremor in her voice. But when the town policeman walked by, she lowered her eyes as if the light itself might betray her. The first time Mateo watched an act that should never have been public, it was in the square in broad light. Don Eusebio, fat in a way that took up other people's air, was on his porch counting coins and giving orders as if the whole valley belonged to him. A young man, Tomas Rivas, Mateo would learn, had been late with a payment on a calving heifer. The man's back still tensed with the shame of arrival when Don Eusebio slapped him in the street, hard enough to make the man stagger. The town heard the sound as if it were the crack of a branch. No one intervened. The silence that followed the slap pressed like a roof. Mateo's hand tightened on the reins, not in anger, but as a response he had no plan for yet. When the slap fell, there was a small involuntary shift. Alma, who had been sweeping steps, paused, the broom handle in her hands becoming a rod of measure. Later, she would not call it courage, not aloud. She called it keeping a place for herself in a world that cost her every coin. If the valley had any law besides silence, it was the business of loans and ledgers. Don Eusebio's papers multiplied the way dust did in a dry storm, every entry thin, inevitable. He lent money against calves and tools, against a season's worth of oats, against marriages and mourning. People paid with labor. Those who could not pay found their names in ink that would gnaw at them for years. For 3 years, Alma's life had been balanced against a debt that refused to be paid. That fact sat like an old wound under the tongue of every conversation. Mateo put down roots slowly because that was the kind of man he was. He fixed a lean fence for an old neighbor, repaired a broken hitch for a boy with more wrist than sense, traded a horse tack for a night's bread. In doing the small things, he learned where the town kept its resentment and where it kept its fear. He learned that most people read their own reflection in Don Eusebio's priorities, a man who hoarded cattle like secrets and kept people's truths behind the lock of his ledger. At night, Mateo watched the town from his rented stall, and in daylight he watched the yard of the Carranza shop. The yard smelled of feed and wet leather, of sun-bleached rope. Alma moved there, not as a prisoner, but in ways that made her motions a map of compromise. When she looked at Mateo the first time they spoke, her eyes had the cautious respect of someone who has rehearsed 1,000 ways to decline an invitation. He spoke first with a workman's directness, offering no salvation. "I do fence work," he said, "and I know how to find a calf that wanders." She said nothing about favors. She said instead a small clear sentence that weighed more than any promise. "Nobody decides for me." He stayed because the place asked him to, and because the sight of the slap under the noon sun lodged like a stone in the architecture of his mind. He did not tell himself he was a rescuer. He told himself he had been near enough to feel what cruelty did to a landscape of people, and he had little patience for cruelty that made itself respectable. The first weeks were about listening. Mateo learned to sit where he could be seen without being spoken to let his attention gather fragments. An old woman who sold pan, thin, aromatic loaves, told him in a voice that smelled of cumin and resignation that Don Eusebio had taken a family's mare for a missed payment. A boy on the outskirts mentioned, as if naming weather, that several calves went missing during the thin hours of the night. Tomas Rivas, when he trusted an afternoon, admitted the slap had not been the first humiliation. The ledger, he said, had a column only Don Eusebio could read, one that turned favors into forever debts. Mateo followed tracks like someone reading a language no one else remembered. He trailed in the dust after a herd, watched the imprint of hooves harden into meaning. He watched fences left with a cut rope, corrals cleaned at odd hours, a man with a foreign accent who came and went on the edge of town and was careful with how he asked questions. Mateo watched the intermediary men, outsiders Don Eusebio hired for things that could not be kept near his name, who moved like ghosts with heavy boots. He kept a record at the back of his mind, the way a rancher keeps tabs on a storm. He only took what he could carry: names, times, places, evidence for a future that might be called when the valley had steadiness enough to stand behind truth. In the third week, he found the first proof. It was accidental, as most beginnings are. He was helping a neighbor mend a sagging panel along a mile-old fence when he noticed a strip of fresh leather tied to a stake. Curious, he followed the trail until it opened into a shallow ravine where several calves had been hidden among scrub, young beasts with brittle tails and the smell of confinement. They were marked in a way that made Mateo's jaw tighten: notched ears, a faint branding purchased with someone else's payment. He did not remove the animals that night. He had learned to weigh the moment, how a wrong return could cost more than it recovered. Instead, he photographed nothing and memorized everything. The next day he returned with Tomas, who had come because a man who had been slapped wanted someone to stand with him while he reclaimed a piece of what was his. They recovered 2 calves before dawn, leading them like washed secrets back through the gates. Word moved quiet as a creek. For the first time in months, something in town changed pitch. Small winds accumulated like pebbles in a creek bed. A widow found a box she had pawned and never seen outside the shop. A boy found his dog chained where Don Eusebio kept tools. Mateo's presence gave people a place to surrender their petty and polite fear. He did not demand they confess. He asked for their memories. He sat with them over cups of weak coffee and let them tell the pattern of loss in the slow, cruel geometry of the ledger. He listened and he wrote. The ledger itself became an obsession of Don Eusebio's. Mateo watched through a window one afternoon as the old man bent over ink and paper, his finger resting on some line that translated names into obligations. It was like watching a heart pulse in the wrong place. Mateo did not steal the ledger. He watched the table. He watched the servant who polished the brass scales and knew when the servant had a new voice in his pocket. He listened at the door of the shop at night and left a stone on a windowsill when he had a lead to pass to Tomas. Nothing ostentatious. The work of a man who understood that loud fury makes the ground tremble and collapse. The work of someone who wanted the ground to hold. Alma came to Mateo's repair work not as a reward, but as economy. She needed a hinge fixed at her small room behind the shop. She needed a gate mended that kept stray chickens out of a patch of land Don Eusebio pretended not to own, but always managed. She watched him with a careful assessment. Once, when a freight of rain soaked the town and the shop's awning wept, she invited him under the sprawl of a scaffold roof and offered him bread that tasted like river mud and kindness. "I don't want my face in other people's mouths," she told him once, while they all wiped wet clay from their boots. It was a small declaration. It could have been said about many things. In it sat everything Alma had learned the hard way. That pity is a kind of ownership if you let it be, and that someone else's plan for your life is another ledger. "I won't be your mouth," Mateo said. He meant it both ways, to not speak for her and to refuse to be loud in ways that would put her at worse risk. He offered his hands, not promises. He worked on the fence near the corral with slow attention so people could see him. He helped a man who had been too proud to accept a hand till the man could reclaim a small herd. In the space between those repairs, people found a place to practice a new language, one where they could ask for help and hear it without shame. 3 years, the town kept saying. 3 years since Alma's life had been counted against a debt that grew like a fungus in a damp place. 3 years since a husband's misstep or a harvest that failed. 3 years of work that never matched the debt, where every coin paid translated into a new clause in the ledger. Years that became habit and then law. When Mateo heard the number, he set it like a small stone in his mouth and rolled it until he could taste its edges. Not everyone in town welcomed his quiet. Don Eusebio noticed his hands, the way they took hold of tools and fixed things. The man noticed other small things that had lately gone missing. A man who once delivered carts now came late. A horse that had once been fat and tamed looked leaner on Don Eusebio's horizon, as if some part of his domain was fraying. The first time Don Eusebio sent a message to Mateo, it arrived in the old way, an envelope left under a stone with a note requiring a man to appear at the shop at evening. The request was not polite. It did not have to be. Threats began as shadow acts. Someone opened Mateo's stall at night and left a smear of tar on the saddle. Then a small lantern was tossed against the edge of his corral and smoldered long enough to make the mare nervous. Mateo set the fire out with a bucket and a slow breath. He counted the scares. 1, then 2. He went to the pan seller and asked who had bought ropes the week before, and the woman looked at him like a person who had been asked to remember a drought. She told him names in pieces. He listened and stored them. When the fire touched his corral, Alma came the next morning with a cloth and her hands already stained with chores. "You should leave," she said, and she said it without pleading. It was a statement of possibility. Mateo shook his head in a way that made room for other truths. He did not leave. He told her quietly that leaving would be her choice, and that he would stand where he could be seen. She met his eyes long enough to accept the boundary, for now. Mateo's method was not to hunt for confrontation, but to gather a roster of small certainties. He coaxed the town into opening its mouths with the same patience he used on a wounded animal. He returned a borrowed sack to a widow and found a receipt folded inside it that had another name on it and an amount that did not match the work done. He walked miles into a ridge to speak with a man who had once worked Don Eusebio's fields and had left because his conscience could not hold the ledger's weight. The man had a tremor in his hands when he spoke of the night calves were moved to the ravine. He gave Mateo a map with a marker made of a coffee stain. By the end of a long week, Mateo had a pattern. Names on the margins, marks on the cattle, the dates that matched missing inventories. He carried the evidence not as a parade but as proof that could be presented. He understood the law enough to know that the valley's authority would listen to more than whisper. A ledger's ink, a returned calf, a witness who could stand and say what they had seen. These were the things that make power answerable. There were moments when his quiet work made enemies who preferred the old geometry. The intermediary men began to shorten their visits. Don Eusebio's smile, once broad and confident like a man whose hands never touched the ledger, thinned into something sharper and close. He sent men with visible belts to stand at the door of his shop on market days. He raised prices on grain to watch for panic. The town watched and measured its breath. One afternoon, when the sun threatened to melt the horizon, Mateo found himself summoned into the shop. Don Eusebio sat at the same table where Mateo had once watched the fingers count coins. The man's voice was oil-slick. "You're new to this valley," he said, as if cataloging a minor fact. "You fix fences. You make nice with people. I don't like men who make trouble." Mateo sat without fidgeting. He felt the shop's air like the husk of a place that had been alive without asking permission. "I'm not here to make trouble," he said. "I don't take what isn't mine." Don Eusebio's laugh was brief. "Things are complicated," he said. "There are rules." "Rules don't have to be thorns," Mateo answered. He kept his voice low because he had learned that low voices sometimes carry farther. Their exchange ended with no more than that, a summons that carried a promise and a threat, both. Mateo left the shop light-footed. He knew the man would make his next steps look legal and tidy. That was the danger of a ledger. It could make cruelty read like sound accounting. As Mateo stepped out, Alma stood near the door, as if she had been leaning against the wall all along. She looked at him with an expression that had folded itself out of restraint and something else, maybe curiosity or maybe calculation. "You should be careful," she said, in the voice of someone who had been careful for 3 years and had become an expert at measuring danger. "You too," he said, thinking of the slap in the ledger and the way a town learns to compartmentalize shame. "You don't get to tell me what to do," she said, and it was not a refusal so much as a map of her insistence. It made Mateo respect her in a way that was not romantic but necessary. He nodded, because honoring a boundary was part of the work. The first ripple of public courage came small and practical. A young man who had lost a cow to Don Eusebio's network came to Mateo with a story and care in his hands. He wanted the animal returned because a cow meant food and a tether to his future. Mateo went with him at dawn, and because the valley was not all henchmen and ledgers, people watched them move with their quiet purpose. They brought the calf back through town, not as a spectacle but as a fact. In the days that followed, people whispered that the calf's return proved that the ledger's reach could be short-circuited. Fear loosened at the edges. Mateo's catalogue improved. He had names to connect to the calves in the ravine. He had a paper scrap of a note Don Eusebio's man had stamped and misfiled. He had Tomas's account of the slap signed with a shaky X. Small things became points of leverage. There were nights when Mateo sat by the corral and counted proofs like rosary beads, a calf hidden, a receipt with a wrong total, a witness who would stand up if someone made space for him. He thought of justice as an accumulation of small, hard objects, not as a sudden thunderclap. Threats grew in pattern. Someone left a horse's hoof marked with a shallow cut, a warning in the language of ranch hands. Someone trapped a net in his mare's corral, slight and strategically placed. Mateo mended the corral stronger, and later found, hooked under a post, a note that said simply, "Leave." He folded the paper into his pocket and did what he always did. He fixed the fence and widened the corral's gate so other animals could pass without being crowded. The gate became a place where people could gather, not an act of bravado but of practicality. Between the repairs and the small seizures of property, the town began to shift. The old pan seller found herself less afraid to call the truth by its name, because she now saw the return of what she had lost. An apprentice at the blacksmith's, who had been silent for 2 seasons, drew a map of nights when Don Eusebio's men moved calves. The town's transformations were not sudden. They crept like green into a field in spring, patient and slightly stubborn. Alma's own changes were quieter than any town rumor. She began to sit in the shade of the shop in the late afternoons, where the light softened and the dust settled. Her shoulders eased with the sort of relief that repaired itself slow as an old saddle. She took on errands that were hers by right, fixing a torn apron, collecting a neighbor's mail, and she did these not as a penance but as practice for an autonomy she had not yet fully tasted. Sometimes she would look at Mateo when he worked, and in those moments there was a tacit recognition that they were allies in a way that did not lease her future to him. The town had its limits. There were families who kept their distance because complicity is often a shape of survival. There were men who pretended airflow could not contain them, and women who learned early to keep their names out of conversations that might cost them a calf. But more faces began to turn toward the gate where Mateo worked. People who had known only to keep silent began to gather like clouds rounding a mountain. It was not a mobilization so much as a relearning that their stories belonged to them. The arson attempt at Mateo's corral came on a dry, windless night. Someone pushed a charred torch into the bracing wood and walked away with the sort of haste that meant they did not want to be seen. The mare whickered and dropped in terror. The bucket caught a lick of flame before Mateo found it. He shoved dirt over the ember, stamped it out, and then sat by the mare until she calmed. He did not tell the town in the morning about the near fire. He did not want to send a chain of fear, but the smell of smoke lingered like a language. When word spread, because secrets will not hold forever, people came, not all at once, but in the way a tide arrives, modest, then inevitable. A few men he had helped gather fences came with tools. The widow who had once been too tired to leave her porch came with a bucket. Alma came with a coil of rope and 2 sandwiches wrapped in cloth. The presence of ordinary hands made a statement. A person could be burned and still be held. Don Eusebio's response sharpened. He closed the shop early for 3 days and then opened it with a blade to his smile. He sent men to stand at road's edge and asked the sheriff in the neighboring town to make visits, the kind that looked like legality but carried the weight of something more insistent. Mateo noticed the timing. In the week after the arson, the sheriff's patrol increased its rounds. He could see how Don Eusebio dressed his threats in paper that could be signed. Mateo's plan did not involve drawing Don Eusebio into a fight where people might be hurt. It involved creating a network of small proofs and producing them in a way that the law could not ignore. He set up meetings with the town's older folk under the pretext of mending harnesses, and they talked in slow circles about what they had seen. He coaxed out names. A man who had once worked as a ledger clerk had emigrated to the next county, but came back after Mateo wrote him a letter asking for one thing: his memory. The old clerk arrived with a hat in his hands and a ledger tucked in his coat like contraband. He had a note in his book where a payment recorded in Don Eusebio's favor did not match an actual exchange. Small errors can be traced to intent, intent traced to theft. The more Mateo collected, the more careful Don Eusebio became. He began to repair fences with his own hands to show a facade of responsibility. He organized charity drives to present a public face that contradicted the ledger. His minions spoke about destiny and order, about the economy of the valley as if it needed one guardian, the sort of language that masks theft with tradition. Alma made choices that clarified the contours of her own strength. One morning, after a market where a man had nearly taken her parcel without paying, she turned and faced the man with a calm that was not fury. She said his full name, as if calling out a crime in a crowded room. The effect was small but significant. The man's shoulder tightened as if a wire had been pulled. She did not seek a scolding or a speech. She sought an immediate, practical demand. "You owe my neighbor for that seed." The man paid in coins because the town watched a woman demand fairness and because he recognized, even if in a small way, that her voice had a new weight. Mateo watched these things like a man watching a manometer rise slowly. He watched Alma shape her own perimeter and refused to cross it with any of his plans. He promised himself, quietly, with the stubbornness of someone who has seen too much of fatal gallantry, that he would not be the kind of man who decides for someone else. He would be a place to stand. One evening, late and heavy with rain that had not come, Mateo assembled the pieces he had gathered and laid them out beneath the lamp in the back of his rented stall. The ledger scrap, the old clerk's notes, the map to the ravine, the signed statement from Tomas, the testimony of the panseller, little things that together might make a case. He thought of the sheriff's visits and the calcified relations in the town. He thought of Don Eusebio counting coins in his chair, sure as a man sitting on a fortune that had the weight of other people's lives. He knew, with the clarity of a man who has worked long hours with his hands, that revelations should be staged for truth, not theater. He needed witnesses who would stand in front of a magistrate and speak plainly. He needed to make the valley itself a place where fear was less persuasive than testimony. He began, therefore, to make a plan that did not require any one man to be a hero. It required only that ordinary people remember what it was to be visible. That night, as he closed up the stall, someone left a small envelope tied to the nail of his door. Inside, in handwriting that trembled between haste and courage, was a sentence. "We have been waiting. We want the ledger." Mateo folded the paper, and instead of feeling vindicated, he felt the narrow hinge of responsibility swing. It was no longer his private game. It was a town waking. The transition in the valley did not sound like a trumpet. It sounded instead like doors opening a little wider. People left their porches and stood at thresholds. Someone nailed a fresh post at the corral and hammered it as if it were a small insistence on possibility. Tomas put away his anger for a moment and called the neighbors to hold the gates. Mateo watched and helped, knowing that his next move must be precise. Evidence arranged and witnesses ready would change the terms of a contest that had always been unequal. Before he could act further, a messenger from Don Eusebio arrived at his stall with a face smoothed by the oils of diplomacy. The man did not enter, but dropped a note with instructions. "Appear at the store at noon." The note smelled faintly of varnish and control. It was an invitation with teeth. Mateo folded the paper and kept it in his pocket. When he looked up, Alma was there, standing in the slack light of morning, the town behind her like a set of low hills. Her eyes rested on him with the quiet test of someone who had been told to hide for 3 years and chose at last to show herself in measured steps. "If you go," she said softly, "remember what you told me. Don't speak for me. Don't make me an argument for you." He nodded. The promise was a map he had traced already. He had no interest in lifting himself onto her story as a pedestal. He had interest in bringing forward facts that could break a ledger and return cattle, keys, and names. He had interest in a community that could reclaim its own voice. Mateo took the road to Don Eusebio's shop at noon without fanfare. He wore no badge and carried no weapon other than a small stack of papers and the steadiness in his hands that came from a lifetime of steadying animals and mending what was broken. The town watched as much as it dared. Men stood near their porches, women shaded their eyes and watched the silhouette of a man who had come to measure the distance between right and ledger. He was not naive. He understood that the moment would not be a collapse of a man into guilt. It would be a legal and social maneuver requiring witnesses, proof, and the endurance of ordinary people who could finally say, together, what was true. He felt the weight of that need like the weather before a storm. He walked toward the shop with the quiet intention of a man who wanted justice made visible and lawful, who wanted no one to be punished by violence for a debt that had been pressed like a thumb into a community's neck. Inside the shop, Don Eusebio lifted his head as if recognizing a piece of dust in a sunbeam. His smile was the same one that had hurt people with its ordinary shape. "Sit," he said, as if the shop were a parlor and not a courtroom. Mateo sat and placed his papers on the table like a small, solid thing. Around them, the town hummed, waiting, afraid, but waiting. The confrontation that would change the terms of a ledger had not yet happened. The town's silence, which had been the ally of abusive calculation for 3 years, trembled now between the poles of fear and the possibility of speaking. When the noon bell hummed and the town's dogs muttered in the distance, Mateo folded his hands and prepared to speak, but not on impulse. He had work to do. He had witnesses to gather and a law to engage. He had to turn small proofs into a narrative the sheriff could not ignore. And as he rose to leave, the weight of all 3 years settled on his shoulders like an old coat he had chosen to wear for a reason. Outside, Alma waited. She did not rush to him in relief, nor to press him to do what she would not allow. Instead, she walked with a quiet gait to the gate and watched the road, her hands folded like a question. Mateo met her eyes and gave a look that meant only this: "I will not decide for you." There was no bravado in it. There was only the measured, patient infrastructure of a man who knew how to move slowly so others could follow. The valley might still choose silence, or it might choose to stand. Mateo had set the first stones of a path that could be walked by many feet. He understood the risk of misstep, the way a wrong word could undo months of patient work. It was not revenge in the old sense, nor was it immediate vindication. It was a plan that required the town to remember its own faces in the ledger, and call for them to be erased. As the afternoon folded into a sky the color of old copper, a small group gathered at the corral, hands once closed now partly open. They had not yet marched on the shop nor drawn a line in dust. They had simply chosen to be seen. The presence of ordinary people did more than any dagger. Mateo stayed until the sun sank and left streaks across the valley, until the horses breathed soft and the town's hum thinned into crickets. He walked back past Don Eusebio's porch and watched from a little distance, the man counting coins like he counted lives. He felt neither hatred nor victory. He felt the slow tightening of a knot a craftsman makes before he pulls the thread taut. There would be nights of waiting. There would be days of coaxing witnesses. There would be times when fear would press and when a ledger might be more persuasive than truth. But the valley had shifted its axis. The first stone had been turned. The plan was quiet and patient. No pyrotechnics, no bullet-laced justice. Mateo's revenge, if it could be called that, was a dismantling done by light and patience. He slept that night with the mare's breath close and the corral's wood creaking like conversation. Outside the town slept too, and in their sleep the murmurs of 3 years of debt wound themselves into dreams. Alma lay behind the shop with a candle that guttered and then steadied, her hand over the small locket she kept closed. She thought of leaving sometimes and of staying other times. What mattered, she decided slowly, was that the decision belonged to her. And in the hours before dawn, as Mateo prepared for another day of quiet work, someone hammered at the back of the shop. A voice, not his or Alma's, called out, low and urgent, "They're bringing a witness from the next county." Mateo folded his blanket, strapped his tools, and walked toward the sound. The town was waking into a different kind of day. The ledger's ink looked less certain in the morning light. He kept his face neutral and his hands ready. He had come to count the small facts the way a rancher counts the days until rain. At the edge of town, where the road spilled into the open range and the grass was a cautious green, a stranger emerged through dust and gate that betrayed a long road. He carried himself with the weary dignity of someone who had kept secrets for too long. In his pocket he had a scrap of paper, and in his memory, a ledger's misfiled note. He had come because Mateo had asked, and because the town's gravity was starting to change. The valley held its breath, and in that breath was the beginning of something that did not look like retribution in the old stories. It looked instead like the law moving, slowly and inevitably, toward a place that had thought itself above account. Mateo watched the stranger's steps and thought of how heavy 3 years could be, and how patient hands sometimes make the only kind of justice that lasts. The stranger walked into town with a stoop that carried both distance and duty. He smelled of the road, and the kind of fatigue that does not leave with sleep. In his pocket, he carried the misfiled page and folded between pages of a ledger, a note that did not belong to Don Eusebio's tidy hand. He had been a clerk once, the man said, years back, before conscience had pushed him across county lines. He had seen accounts that did not match goods, and he had kept the sort of detail that will ruin a man who builds dominion from other people's poverty. Mateo met him at the corral where the town gathered, and they spoke quietly in a place designed for work and witness. The clerk laid his pages out like a small constellation. Mateo read them with the patient eye of someone who knows how details map into truth. Dates that matched missing calves, charges tacked to names that did not belong, a pattern of false lending. There were marks where the ink had been forced to cover something else. Small, then larger, the evidence gathered weight. Mateo did what he had done from the first day. He turned small facts into something that could call the law. He had written a careful letter to the magistrate in the neighboring town, had described what he'd found, and asked for a legal officer to come and see. He had not called for immediate arrest. He knew the danger of spectacle. He had asked for a warrant and a neutral hand to take the ledger, to catalogue the calves returned, to take sworn statements. Now the clerk's arrival made the request hard to ignore. It took 2 days for the sheriff to ride up the road. He wore the practical face of a man who had seen both greed and grief. The sheriff's horse was lean from travel, and his satchel contained stamped papers. He dismounted with the ease of habit, and the town watched as if it were a weather change. Don Eusebio, to his credit, tried to make the sheriff see only tidy accounts and civic stability. He offered coffee and the smooth rhetoric of a man whose ledger had become the town altar. Mateo met the sheriff on the porch, hands stained from fence work. He handed the man a pile of statements, a map, the clerk's pages, and the list of recovered calves. The sheriff read, then read again. He asked practical questions, the kind that make room for facts. Where did you find the cattle? Who hid them? Who made entries in the ledger? Each answer added more weight to what had been whispers. Don Eusebio's face shifted as he realized the law might not be pliable. He tightened his smile and then tried another move. Denial dressed as confidence. He told the sheriff that trade had complexities beyond a traveler's comprehension. He offered testimony from those who lived comfortably under his rule. But the ledger did not lie in the way men lie. The ink traced a different story. The first formal act was small and precise. The sheriff, with the clerk and with Tomas as a witness, removed the ledger from behind the counter and closed it with a ribbon. He then served a notice of seizure, explaining that where accounts were dubious, a neutral party would take custody while the state examined them. Don Eusebio's protestations softened when men in uniform took inventory of marks on cattle and the maps of the ravine where the hidden animals had been kept. What broke the town's old geometry more than papers was the presence of the people themselves. Mateo had not planned a grand march. He had built the conditions for ordinary courage. Now when the sheriff asked if anyone would swear to what they had seen, voices rose from porches and kitchens. The pan-seller, who had wrapped dough in her apron for decades, stepped forward and described a mare taken in the thin hours. Tomas signed a statement with a shaky hand but precise words about the slap that had cost him pride and made him small. The blacksmith's apprentice spoke of nights he had watched lights move cattle into the ravine. Each testimony was a small hammer. Don Eusebio tried to buy silence in old currencies. Offers, threats, the intimations that a man with money could make trouble arrive in other forms. He offered payments to a few who had come forward. They walked from him with no cash. The town was learning a new economy, one of witness instead of fear. The sheriff listened and catalogued. Where he could verify cattle and receipts, he made notes. Where testimony matched physical evidence, plow marks in the ravine, notches on ears, he nodded. Mateo watched the exchange from where his hands had a place on the corral gate. He felt the baby shift a particular way. This was not about him. It was about a ledger that had been a weapon for 3 years, and now a group of ordinary people were asking for the law to see it plainly. The sheriff, mindful of procedure, read the warrants aloud. Where accusations meet process, the town shuddered and did not break. Don Eusebio was not arrested in a way some might have imagined. No sudden violent fling, no shouts turned into blood. He was asked to accompany the sheriff to the office in the neighboring town to answer for irregular accounts and for the possession and movement of animals. The sheriff was practical. Don Eusebio could present his defense before a magistrate. The ledger would go with him. The men with belts who had stood at the door found themselves watched by neighbors who had once feared them. One of them tried to push into a crowd and was met with cold faces. He backed down. Before the sheriff left with Don Eusebio, a smaller act of justice took place that mattered more to those who had been robbed than anything the magistrate could hand down later. The sheriff ordered buyers of disputed cattle to come forward. A few did, their faces pinned with the discomfort of being seen. Some returned animals at a loss, some paid fines. Mateo himself walked into the corral and helped lead reclaimed calves through the gate as people clapped in mouths so small they barely passed air. It was not triumphal, it was relief, heavy, honest relief. Alma stood at the corral. She watched the calves walk through the gate, their tails flicking at flies in a way that did not seem miraculous but that felt like recovery. She had not spoken much in the days of the sheriff's work. She had chosen boundaries and respected them. Mateo did not speak for her. When the sheriff requested witnesses, Alma stepped forward with a paper in her hand. It was not a dramatic testimony. It was a short, factual statement, dates, debts, the ways the ledger had recorded more than it should. She wrote with a hand that trembled once and then steadied. There was a moment when Don Eusebio looked at Alma, and for an instant, all the arrogance in his face softened into something like naked calculation, how her testimony might shape the course of his life. He tried to make her a piece of his defense, a way to show that the ledger was a business arrangement. Alma met him with eyes that had spent 3 years learning the weight of small decisions. She said nothing dramatic to him. She said what she had always said to Mateo. No one decides for me. She had chosen to put her name on a statement, not because anyone had forced her, but because she had come to a conclusion that days of labor and nights of watchfulness could be put into words. She wanted, in the legal sense, to unfasten the ledger's hold on her life. She wanted to name the months and the charges and ask that debt be released where it had been built on falsity. The sheriff took her statement and arranged for a formal deposition in the neighboring town. There would be a hearing, he said. The law moves slowly enough to be infuriating and slowly enough to be careful. But the ledger would not hold sway in the way it had. Don Eusebio's authority, built on paper and intimidation, had finally met the solidity of process. Once the sheriff left with his custody papers and Don Eusebio's hat in hand, the valley shifted. It did not break into celebration. People went back to work, to mending fences and making bread and carting oats. But there were small differences everywhere. A gaze more direct when two neighbors spoke, a woman who walked to market without looking down. The town had learned how to be visible again. Mateo stayed in town the pace of a man who will not rush a thing that heals. He helped the sheriff catalog the cattle marks and took the rough copy of the ledger as the sheriff asked for a local record. He continued to fix fences and to sit and listen. He sat with Alma on a bench behind the shop for a time that felt like a necessary silence. "You don't owe me anything," Alma told him once in the quiet after the day had given up heat. "You don't owe anyone anything," he said. He would not let the conversation become larger than its truths. He would not praise, and he would not presume. He offered the steadiness of a companion who knows his measure. Alma folded her hands, thought of the 3 years like a weight she had carried, and then sat down. "I need to leave for a while," she said. "I need to see if I can be a person who is not named in a ledger." Mateo saw the line of decision in her face and did not try to redraw it. He knew from his own past that movement can be a way to test a heart. He had losses too that taught him space is sometimes the truest kindness. "Go," he said. "There is a valley to the west where the grass grows in a soft way. Take what you need. The gate will be open if you return." She looked at him then with an expression that was not gratitude so much as a mutual recognition. Two people who had been through storms and who had learned to set boundaries around one another. She took a small pack with a few linen shirts. The locket she kept closed around her neck, and she left before dawn the next day. She walked out of the town with the light on her back and no one calling her brave. She was simply moving into a life she had chosen. The months that followed were ordinary in their healing. Alma lived with a cousin in a valley beyond the ridgeline. She washed, she learned the measure of sleep without fear, she traded eggs and bread, and slowly found that her hands remembered more than suffering. She wrote once to Mateo with a short line, "The air here is soft. I am practicing being a person." Mateo replied with a line about a lost fence and a received calf. Their letters were brief and careful, threaded through a respect that refused urgency. The legal wheels turned more slowly. Don Eusebio's trial took time. He hired a lawyer who spoke in calm, incriminating tones about bookkeeping practices and the difficulty of rural commerce. But the facts, once they had been organized, were hard to argue away. Recorded payments without exchanges, cattle that had changed hands in the ravine, the clerk's pages that had corrected numbers. The magistrate in the neighboring town had seen such schemes before. He had a patient way of listening to ledgers and then looking at faces. When the verdict came, it was procedural and consequential. Don Eusebio was found to have falsified records and to have exercised undue coercion to obtain labor and goods. The magistrate ordered restitution where it could be made measurable and the seizure of certain cattle as collateral. There would be fines and there would be a period of oversight. Don Eusebio, whose arrogance had relied on the quiet complicity of neighbors, was led away with a hat in his hand and a small parade of neighbors who watched with a certain new steadiness. He did not meet Alma's eyes. Some of the intermediary men were identified and picked up by law enforcement as part of the same investigation. They had names and addresses and a history that could be traced. A few attempted to flee and were caught. Others vanished as the town rearranged itself without them. No one in the valley cheered their capture loudly. The work had been done with the legal instruments of a county and the testimony of people who had decided to be visible. In the aftermath, the sheriff returned to check on the cattle and the receipts, and he spent an afternoon drinking weak coffee with Mateo on a porch while dust settled on the fields. He told Mateo that the valley could expect a slow rebuilding, trust restored in pieces. Mateo nodded. He thought of how long it had taken to find the ravine and to coax a clerk back across county lines. He thought of how justice, when it moves on its own terms, tends to be durable. Alma's return, months later, had none of the theatrics of the old stories. She came back not because a man had made a place for her, but because she had decided she wanted to test that decision with time. She arrived with a little more ease in her walk and a few letters sewn into a pocket. She sat on the corral gate and watched as the town's rhythms had rearranged themselves into small, honest work. She paused at the sight of a calf that nuzzled at its mother and then at Mateo. He was leaning on a post, hands white with sand from pushing earth. He did not rush to her. He acknowledged her with a look that held no ownership, only familiarity. "Have you come back because you thought you should?" he asked, because he had learned to ask things plainly. "No," she said. "I came back because this place needs to be seen through different eyes sometimes, and because I wanted to see if I could stand here and not be named by a debt." The valley had space now to rebuild not only fences but relations. Alma took a small room not behind the shop but in a house with a thin garden. She planted beans because beans teach patience. She sold bread at market and kept her coin in a little box she counted at night. When she and Mateo walked together sometimes in the late light, it was a walk without assumption. They spoke of small things, how to graft a branch where a spring ran, of practical matters that build a life. Mateo did not become a rescuer in the town's conversations. He became someone who had kept a place of steady work and had used patience as a strategy. People respected him for that, and he respected Alma for the choices she made. Their friendship grew without hurry, like grass in a valley after rain. There were nights when they shared a meal and did not talk about the ledger. There were mornings when Mateo would hand her a new tool and she would show him how to use it. Each exchange was a match of equals. Years in ranch towns do not erase scars, but they teach new textures. Alma learned to refuse charity that came with strings. She learned to hold business conversations and to claim payment. She sat sometimes on the edge of the corral and let the sun fix her face, and she would think of the 3 years that had once kept her small. She did not forget. She also did not let the memory define every day. Don Eusebio's removal from the center of town left a new rhythm. The shop changed hands. The ledger's ink no longer had the power to bruise people into silence. People learned to speak directly, to file complaints, to protect their animals. The town's courage was not a single act, but a habit that had to be practiced. Mateo watched as neighbors learned to name things for what they were and to keep a ledger of their own, one of honest exchange. On an evening when the valley's light tilted soft as a lullaby, Mateo and Alma walked out beyond the ridgeline into a small private hollow where grass held water and the wind was less harsh. They planted a young apple tree. It was not a symbol so much as a practical thing. They wanted fruit in the future and a shade in years. Mateo dug with steady work. Alma pressed the soil around the roots with hands that had learned to measure a life in chosen rhythms. They did not declare love in saccharine phrases. There were no vows made to tame the past, only a mutual agreement to be present. They built a small lean-to near the tree and put there a pack of tools and a kettle. Their days were not free of trouble. Markets had bad seasons, and there were always old debts to untangle for others. But the pattern by then was their own: slow repair, honest work, and the careful refusal of old powers. In the evenings they would sit with the mare tethered nearby, watching the wind write its slow language across the grass. Alma sometimes took off the locket she had kept shut, and sometimes she let Mateo see the inside, 2 faded photographs and a scrap of cloth. She did not owe him the telling of why she kept it, she only showed it when she wanted. Mateo, who had known quiet and loss, understood that everything in life could not be claimed or repaired by one hand. He had learned to stand where he could be seen, and to let others choose what to do with their lives. The town's story passed on in small acts: a neighbor helping another mend a roof, children learning to mark cattle properly, a market where the ledger was a record rather than a chain. People would sometimes tell the tale of how the sheriff came and Don Eusebio was taken to trial, but more often they told smaller stories: how a widow had her coin returned, how a boy had his dog back. These were the measures that mattered to the valley. Mateo's quiet actions became a piece of that fabric, a man who did not need to make spectacle to shape an outcome. Time, which had once been a creditor's ally, became a healer in the small things. Alma's voice regained a tone that belonged to her. She spoke to neighbors, she traded, she sat on porches and told stories that were not about the ledger, but about weather and horses. The 3 years remained an axis in her life, but not the only one. Mateo left once to ride a road to the south, where he tended a herd for a season, and when he returned, Alma had bread in the oven and a new notch of light in her eyes. They had both practiced being people who make choices. Their relationship was not sheltered from pain. It lived with it, but pain no longer had the power to name them without their consent. On a late afternoon, when the apple tree was a young sentinel, Mateo and Alma stood with hands pressed into earth and watched a calf stride in the distance. They did not need words to mark what had been done. Silent revenge, Mateo would say to himself on nights when the quiet pressed in, was not about blotting a man from the world with a single blow. It was about turning a ledger that had been a weapon into a document the law could read plainly, about coaxing neighbors back into a habit of witness, about giving a woman room to choose her life again. It was about patience and about the steady gathering of truths until power answered not with force, but with accounting. When the market bell rang and the town stirred into evening work, Mateo and Alma walked back toward the small house and the corral. The wind moved through the valley, making the sign on the general shop creak softly like an old complaint. They moved slowly without fanfare, content in the knowledge that some injustices require slow hands and patient feet. The ledger that had once judged people now sat in a public office with stamps and signatures. It could no longer be used to hold a person's life as a hostage. If what had happened in that valley had a shape, it was one of small cumulative acts. It was not a story that fit neatly into legends of lone heroes. It was a story about people who learned together to be visible and to hold one another to account. It was about a cowboy who chose to stay, not to own a life, but to stand where the town might feel safe enough to speak. It was about a woman who reclaimed her story, not by being rescued, but by choosing. If this story moved you, subscribe for more true field tales about justice, patience, and second chances.